Do Messianic Jews and other pronomian, that is pro-law Christians, teach a false gospel? Recently, a YouTuber by the name of R.L. Solberg claimed that we do. Why does he think that? Well, because we believe and teach that the law of Moses remains in effect. Here's what he said.
Torah keepers who preach that every Old Covenant command is still in effect today, even including the Yom Kippur sin sacrifices, are robbing the cross of its power and glory. They're belittling the glorious and once and for all sacrifice of Jesus and all he accomplished. They're preaching a false gospel. And shame on anyone who teaches such things.
In his video, Solberg was responding to my video on how Christian scholars reconcile Paul, Ezekiel, and the author of Hebrews on the topic of animal sacrifices. I showed how there is no conflict between them because it is impossible for animal sacrifices to take away sin. That was never their function. And so there is no problem with the fact that Paul and Ezekiel endorse the sacrificial system. They are not disagreeing with Hebrews. In fact, Christian scholars have demonstrated that the author of Hebrews endorses the validity of the sacrificial system as well. There's no problem. As Dr. Jesper Svartvik writes, quote, Jewish Christ believers continued to worship in the temple up to the very end of the book of Acts. This participation in the cult existed alongside their thinking of and describing Jesus' death as a sacrifice, so the two do not seem to have been understood as mutually exclusive. If the temple is standing as it was in the book of Acts, and as Ezekiel predicts it will be during the future millennium, then the laws related to the temple are in effect at those times. Paul's and Ezekiel's endorsement of the sacrificial system in no way detracts from the value of the Messiah's work on the cross, because they were never intended to accomplish what only the Messiah's work could. Now, Solberg disagrees. As he said, anyone who agrees with Paul, Ezekiel, and the author of Hebrews that these parts of the law remain in effect when the temple is standing is teaching a false gospel. By the way, see this video to learn why Solberg's supersessionist approach to this topic is wildly out of step with biblical teaching. In this video, I'm not going to go through Solberg's entire response. He just repeats the very objections that Christian scholars have already thoroughly refuted. The gist of his video is that Messianic Jews and other Christians are replacing Christ with a false gospel because we believe the law of Moses is still in effect, and I've already demonstrated in detail how there is no conflict between Christ and the law. Again, see this video. Instead, I just want to highlight one thing that demonstrates how insane Solberg's position is. As I mentioned earlier, Paul endorses the sacrificial system in Acts 21. He participates in a vow and worships at the temple to demonstrate that he lived in observance of the law of Moses. Solberg's position logically requires us to condemn Paul as preaching a false gospel because Paul is clearly giving the impression that the law of Moses, including the sacrificial system, remains in effect. By the way, for an excellent study on this passage and 1 Corinthians 9, which thoroughly refutes Solberg's supersessionist theology, I recommend this book by Messianic Jewish scholar Dr. David Rudolph. Now, for Messianic Jews and Pronomian Christians, this passage is not a problem. As I already explained in detail, Paul's endorsement of sin sacrifices, by their very nature and purpose, could never detract from the Messiah's sacrifice. But Solberg maintains that affirming the validity of sin sacrifices after the Messiah's work, like Paul did, is promoting a false gospel. So how does he reconcile this? Well, he tries to get around this passage by saying that the sin sacrifice endorsed by Paul in Acts 21 was not the Yom Kippur sacrifice, so apparently it doesn't count. But the Nazirite sin offering that Paul endorsed is required to make atonement, so I'm not sure why that distinction matters. He also tries to get around this text by claiming that Paul did not finish the process, so again, this doesn't count. But that is irrelevant because James still told Paul to do this. This would imply, according to Solberg's theology, that James preaches a false gospel and that Paul agreed to just go along with it. Solberg has also claimed elsewhere that Paul only agreed to do this thing because he wanted to promote the gospel. He argues that Paul was simply trying to be all things to all men, and not really trying to convey that he believes the law is still in effect. In other words, Paul was just trying to appease those legalistic Jews. But again, James still told Paul to do this, not to be all things to all men, but explicitly to demonstrate that Paul did not teach against the law. Also, how can giving a sin offering be allowed for the purpose of promoting the gospel to Jews, while at the same time conflicting with Christ's sacrifice? Wouldn't that undermine the very gospel Paul is seeking to promote? Solberg is aware of these implications and just dismisses them by saying that the apostles and Jewish believers were still trying to figure stuff out and didn't really realize all of the implications of Christ's sacrifice and all the stuff that he did away with. But this event takes place after Christ opened the disciples' minds to understand what the scriptures teach about the work of the cross, so surely they would have already understood that the sacrificial system conflicts with Christ's work if that were indeed the case, and yet their actions contradict what we would expect if Solberg is right. Again, for more on the massive exegetical and theological problems with Solberg's supersessionist interpretation of this passage, see Dr. Rudolph's book. So Solberg is in quite the theological pickle, if you will, and I just want us all to appreciate how utterly insane his theology really is. Not only does it logically demand that we condemn Paul and James, but also the Messiah himself, because the Messiah himself taught that the law of Moses remains in effect. So guess what? If you, along with the majority of Christian scholars, by the way, take Christ at his word in Matthew 5:17-20, you are preaching a false gospel. By teaching that the law of Moses is no longer in effect, Solberg promotes the doctrine of antinomianism. That is the classic definition. Dr. Richard Averbeck, a former professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, says that Solberg's notion that we are under no obligation to keep the law of Moses is a, quote, common antinomian misconception. He writes, quote, to say that we are under no obligation to fulfill the standards of the law is to miss the point of passages like Romans 8:4, which states that the righteous requirements of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the sinful nature, but according to the Spirit. The same Spirit who inspired the writing of the Old Testament law in the first place works within us and among us to bring our hearts and therefore our lives into conformity to the law he inspired. It should be noted that while Solberg's position is wildly out of step with Christian teaching, he is not the first person to say that the law and gospel are incompatible. In the 2nd century, a teacher named Marcion said the same thing. Tertullian, an early Christian apologist, explains that Marcion's teachings focused on showing the supposed incompatibility between the law and the gospel. Again, Solberg makes the same argument. He literally has a teaching titled Why We Cannot Follow the Gospel of Jesus and the law of Moses at the same time, and in that teaching he argues why the law and gospel are contradictory and Christians cannot affirm both. I address Solberg's errors in these videos. And that is the same argument that Solberg is making in this case. If you are teaching that the law of Moses is still in effect, you are preaching a false gospel, according to him, because the two cannot coexist. Now, the early Christians condemned Marcion as a heretic, but unfortunately, as we have seen, we are hearing echoes of his antinomian teachings today among those who claim that the law of Moses is no longer in effect. As Dr. Averbeck writes, quote, Marcion of Sinope, for example, was anti-Jewish and even promoted a limited canon and avoided any positive reference to the Mosaic law as he saw it. The early church fathers rejected Marcion as a heretic, but the Marcionite antinomian against the law tendency has remained alive and well in the church nonetheless. So this antinomian doctrine that people like Solberg are promoting, it's not something new, guys. It's an old heresy that Christians in every generation have had to confront. So I just want to encourage you, stand firm on the truth of the gospel. Stand firm on the truth and authority of God's word. Don't let people like Solberg accuse you of preaching a false gospel simply because they don't like that you agree with Jesus. Personally, I'm going to stick with the words of our Messiah and the apostles over the teachings of an internet preacher who regurgitates the doctrines of a 2nd century heretic.